Welcome everyone to applying to graduate studies in humanities field. My name is Emma Barnes. I am a first year student in CSUB's Master of Arts program in history. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Stephen Allen, the Associate Professor of History and Director of CSUB's History Master's Program. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Allen, and please feel free to say hello and share your screen.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And let me go ahead and do this screen share really quick. Thank you very much for coming today. And so we're going to be talking about grad school in humanities, obviously with a bit of a focus on history. But again, I think some of the stuff is applicable. And if you do have further questions or comments, by all means, let me know. And I can also direct you to the graduate director program, their directors to, for further questions. Okay, and so today then what we're going to do is go over, first part of this presentation we'll go over is crafting a personal statement. Then we'll talk a little bit about resume or CVs, the academic term, curriculum vitae. They're basically the same thing, just one's academic, one's not academic. References and securing references, classes and workload. I'll give you also a little bit of insight into what it actually looks like. And then finally, other advice. And so again, this is history driven, but I think some of the stuff can apply to other fields. So components of a personal statement, I think our department, we put a limit at like 400 words, like a page and a third, a page and a half. If it's 1 to 2 pages, it's fine. We just don't necessarily want to read like War and Peace, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages. Just give us a page or two. And these are just some of the components. Again, if it's English or Spanish, it might, you can just kind of substitute that for history. One is what got you into history? Okay, so you can discuss a little bit, give us a little bit of like your intellectual biography. I've always liked history, or I really took a course in college, really got me into history. I wasn't into it before, now I am, or I've always been into it. That's fine. What kind of history do you like? And just, again, we're not going to, at our program, we're not actually concerned, like if you mention a certain type of history or certain, well, actually, we don't do that here. We just want to see what you're interested in. In the MA program, we're pretty flexible with what you can look at. But again, it's just to make sure that you've kind of thought about what you might want to do. Okay. This is not just, you're just like a whim and then just like, I'm applying to the program for the heck of it, right? That you kind of put some thought into this. And then this kind of, the next one transitions into it well is, what do you want to focus on in the program? So while I'm here, maybe I want to do US history, Latin American history, or I want to do women's history or something like that. And again, we're not going to hold you to that. Again, it's just that you provided some thought about the field. And I think this would apply as well to the other fields as well. And also why this program. And so for this, and again, it's not too much, but you might just want to say, hey, I'm interested in working with this professor, or I'm just really excited about the opportunity, that this program has like these types of courses or whatever. And again, it just shows that you've done a little bit of research on us. Okay. The other thing you might want to put into is the personal statement it's an important component. It's actually really important though, if your GPA is borderline. Okay. And so for us, our program, our minimum is 3.0. And if you're kind of on that borderline area, but you give us a really good personal statement, and there could be reasons why your GPA is what it is, and the 3.0 GPA is a very good GPA. But we want to make sure that you'll be successful in the program. And if you show us that, like, hey, I'm really interested in stuff, I've really thought about this, that makes your application much more, appealing and will help increase your chances of being accepted. I'll be honest, if you have like a 4.0 GPA, yeah, your personal statement will help. Your 4.0 GPA is going to help a lot too. Okay, so but again, sometimes you need to give a little bit of intellectual biography. Also, if someone gives us total short shrift, doesn't give us a statement, or gives us like 3 sentences, even if they have a great GPA, we might think this person, you wonder like how serious they are, or how much their passion for the subject. The other thing here then, also, I didn't put on my slide, we'll get to it in a second. Actually, we'll move on to the things we look for. One thing is that your sentence, it's well written, okay? And again, you should have other people proofread it. Just make sure it's kind of free of grammatical errors and stuff like that, and it generally makes sense. I would also recommend that if you're not 100% sure, always contact the director. It could be our program, it could be other history programs, or even the other programs in humanities, to make sure that you're on the right track. By the way, are these like, what do you want covered in your personal statement? That's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask. But also, we're looking to see if you understand the field a bit, you have knowledge. And again, this is extremely helpful. If you have a history degree and you've done really well in your classes, you probably have a good understanding. We can see that on your transcripts. But if you are a non-history major and you want to come in, this would be a good opportunity to show off your passion, your knowledge, and things like that. And then again, and what happens is this leads us to this last part here, conditional versus full acceptance. Sometimes people without history backgrounds, if they apply and they're appealing, we can conditionally accept them. And basically you would come in and take some upper division courses, and with a qualifying GPA, let's say like a 3.25 GPA in those 3 courses or 4 courses, you're automatically accepted. You are fully accepted into the program. If you do not hit that GPA, you're kicked out of the program. Okay. And so it's a way for us to see if you're from outside as a history major, it gives you an opportunity to prove yourself. And on one level, this might seem tough or whatever, but it's actually for us, we need to make sure that we have people in the program who are going to finish. And you do need a 3.25 GPA to graduate from this program and to be considered passing. In graduate school, C's are not considered passing. Okay. It's B is a kind of a shaky grade, B plus, A minus, A. All right. And we need to make sure you're getting through the program because frankly, we don't want you to pay for 3 or 4 semesters of tuition and then be like, by the way, oh, sorry, no degree. You can't qualify. You're not qualifying. That doesn't make us look good. It's not good for you financially. And so we're going to put that in there. But that also means if you don't have the perfect resume or you have the perfect background, there's an opportunity to work your way into the program and prove yourself. The other thing I would just mention with the personal statement that we'd also look for is sometimes people don't have perfect GPAs, right? And there could be reasons for that. And if you can give an explanation, it could be, hey, the transition to college was really tough. Transition from community college to, the 4-year university was tough. You had issues, education wasn't really stressed in your family or something like that. Like there's many reasons. There's going to be stresses going on. And obviously with COVID-19, we know there's tons of stresses. People lost jobs. People had to work extra hours, right? There's all things that could potentially play in there if your GPA is not perfect. Okay. And we are more than willing to listen to that. And that personal statement is an opportunity to just provide some explanation there on that. And again, and really, if you're someone who's overcome something and can show some, that you can persevere, that makes you a pretty good candidate for graduate study. Okay. Because there's a lot of challenges involved. So that's not necessarily, again, someone you may have a lower GPA, but actually like they just increasingly improved their GPA throughout their career. That's great. That means you've been learning and adjusting and achieving. That's fantastic. Okay. Sometimes you have a dip. One semester's bad. It could be an illness. It could be something happened with family, whatever. By the way, this one semester and this hurt my GPA. That goes into personal statement as well, just to give, again, a quick explanation. And that allows us, when we're looking at things, to make sure that it gives some more information for us. So I will stop from there. And do we have questions then?
It looks like there's a couple questions in the chat, Dr. Allen. Does this program require a writing sample? Does undergraduate research experience make your history MA application more competitive?
Yes, and I will get to the writing sample a little. That's a very good question. And I will hit to that one in the other advice at the end. Okay, so that's a good question. I'll talk about that more. We do require one, and particularly it's for obviously history majors. We want to see that they can write well, but also it helps if you're a non-major, if you've done some work with primary sources, because that's what we're big on in history. It would be it's important for us to see. I don't know if Spanish requires one. I believe English requires a writing sample as well. So we're going to get to the general humanities issue. That is important, whereas other programs do not require a writing sample, but in the humanities, the writing is really important. Is there one more here? It looks like on funding opportunities. At the moment, we do not have funding opportunities for the MA program. That's a very good question. Some other schools do. That's something I think the CSUB is looking to do university-wide. Maybe you provide TA shifts, might be a little tricky, but at least graduate assistantships as research assistants for students. Right now, we don't have any. That's a good question. And then do I change my personal statement to cater to each program that I apply? Aspects of it, yes. And this is a very good question too as well, because on one level, you would like why this program might be a little different, right? Also, why you're applying to an MA program versus why you're applying to a PhD program is different. And you may do MA programs as like a safety, like maybe more a safety school. They're easier to get into than a PhD program. And so the PhD is very specific, and you might be really pitching a project in your personal statement. And I already had an idea of what I want to do for my dissertation. You're not going to be held to that, but if you have an idea of what you'd like to do for your dissertation, you're putting that in your PhD personal statement. Whereas in an MA program, you can be a little bit more general and just talk about what you kind of like. Again, because that's the MA study is a little bit different than PhD study. And I will talk a little bit later as well into the other advice. I have a section there on some more stuff on specifically for PhDs. But yeah, just there may be some stuff to cater. You might be substituting stuff. If you're applying the different MA programs like us versus Fresno State versus I think Northridge has one, you'd substitute maybe the professors. Maybe if one school has, I think Northridge has a lot on like Chicano and Central American studies. And if that's an interest to you, we don't have a program like that here, but you might put that in there. But you're also doing that personal statement, especially why this program, you're just going to show off a little bit that you did some background research, particularly that last paragraph. Maybe the rest of it might be the same because your biography, your interests are your interests, but that last paragraph, I think, is the one where you're doing most of the catering to a specific program. Go ahead on to the next section here, resume and CV. And for our program, we do not require one, okay? For programs that do require one, I would just say the most important thing is to make it clear and with relevant experience, okay? Now, if you're out of school for years, then you want to make sure, yeah, hey, I had like employment here and here. You know, you might want to fill in those gaps a little bit, but you don't need to go, it's not like those resumes where you're like, you don't need to list every, like the 3 things you did, manage 3 people on a committee on this. Like, you have to do that kind of stuff of the resume if it's not necessarily like history related. You can just mention, hey, I had jobs, and then here's the stuff I've done for history. So the things like you mentioned, and I'll get back, I actually remember you mentioned your undergrad research experience. That also may be something you would put in your personal statement. You also might have put that into your CV as well, because that's relevant professional experience for the field. And so that would make you more competitive for definitely for a history MA program. It also make you more competitive for a PhD. And so that's undergrad experience, any research experience, you would definitely put that in your CV, even if you're not getting paid, right? Because sometimes we think of resumes as like our job experience, but you're actually looking at your like work experience for this particular field, right? And that's so the things that may be jobs you may, if you work like 10 years at a bank, that's in there because it's but it's in there to fill in time so people don't understand that there was a gap there. But it's not necessarily, unless there's some skills from there that you did, if you worked in archives or something like that for in a financial institution, then you might want to put that in there. The other thing to put in there is relevant cultural experiences. And I'll give you my own experience was when I was applying to programs of PhD programs, for example, I mentioned I study Latin America. I'm not of a Latin American background or heritage, but I'd spent time, I taught English in Costa Rica for a couple months. So I put that in my CV, even though that's not necessarily history related, it was Latin America related. I also worked in migrant education in New Jersey with, a large percentage of like migrants from like Mexico and Guatemala and Haiti. And so that was also in my CV, when I put that in my resume, because it's, again, it may not necessarily be a historical job, but it's also for what I was pitching myself as someone who studies Latin America. These are my experiences with the region and people from the region. Okay, so if things like that are also a good example, things that you might want to put in there. And again, it helps to kind of flesh out what you're doing there. For the MA, it's nice, but again, MA is a little bit more, you're studying the field. You don't have to worry about like the specificity of a potential dissertation project, because MA, you can also do exams versus a thesis. Also, just concise is better. If you give someone a 10, and this is always, I think nowadays they say professionally, like if you have a, just for in the business world, like a 1-page resume, I would say your resume, if it's 1 to 2 pages, if it gets onto a third, that's fine. But like if you're giving someone like a 10-page resume, like no, like people are going to have they may not look at it as much, or they might just like it loses its effectiveness. Okay, so I would really say 1 to 2 pages, maybe onto a third. So we have one here. Does CSUB's MA program offer concentrations in public history or museum studies? It does not officially, but you can work. We have Dr. Dodd is a public historian. We also have a lot of our graduate students work in the archives with Professor Livingston. We also have, and then I know through, as far as with museums, one of our graduate students right now in our program, Rachel Hads, works over at the Kern County Historical Society. So to be someone to get into contact with, there is an opportunity to get credit for work. We have a history practicum course, which is like history 6,000. You could do an internship at a museum, in archives, whatever, and you would get 3 credits for it, and that would contribute to your grade. So there's not an actual official certificate or official program, but there's definitely opportunities. And like I said, and Dr. Dodd has, you could take like one of his 4,000 level courses on public history and things like that. Now would count towards the degree as well. So there's definitely an opportunity to create that niche and to go in that direction. All right, so now we're going to talk about getting references, okay? I would say this, for the PhD versus MA, the PhD letter of reference it's a little different because, again, it's geared that this person's going to be able to do a dissertation, okay? In the MA program, we have a thesis track and we have an exam track that you can pull off you're not going to have to pull off a 300-page research project. Like that's not the end of it. Thesis is usually 75 to 100 pages. Exams are 1 semester usually that they take for preparation. So the PhD one is a slightly different recommendation. Then you want someone, and you make sure someone who's seen you do research and that you can carry out a research project, that you work well with primary sources. MA, that's a good person for a recommendation if someone can tell you that you can do a research project, but you can also get someone who's seen you in class and say, hey, this person's a really good student. That's fine. And sometimes students want to know who to ask. And I would say at least one, if you are one person who's a history professor, and again, if you have someone else if there's another professor you know really well who's in sociology or whatever in education, that's fine too. Then sometimes they may know you personally and know how you're just a good student and you can work well. But if you have at least one letter from someone in the history department, and this goes to any program I think you're applying to, make sure you have at least one. We require 2 letters in our program. Some like PhD programs and stuff require 3 letters. So if you're applying to a PhD, I would say have 2 out of the 3 be historians. Okay, so at least one a history professor, and at least one of your professors has you at the upper division level. Okay, if you have 2 professors that have you at surveys, that's fine, but that upper division is like the next step up before graduate school. And so if you can have at least one person say, hey, this person was really good in upper division, of course, they really did that excellent research or excellent work in class, that is, that would be a good person to ask. Also, there's a tendency, I think, sometimes for students to ask their friendliest professors versus the ones where they get good grades in. And even if you have, I would recommend the professor who gives you an A or an A minus might be a better professor to write you a recommendation for graduate school, unless you know someone really well personally, right? But if someone gives you an A or an A minus, they respect your work. They respect you as a, and even if they might seem a little cantankerous or whatever, they may not be like the center of the party. That's someone who academically respects your analysis and respects your historical work. Okay, and so I would not worry about that. And if in general we like writing letters of recommendation, we want people to move on. And so again, like I said, if you're not quite sure, go with the person who gave you a higher grade. They can write you a letter and they can attest to the fact that you have excellent scholarly work and that they really respect your work. That's it. If you really need help or anything like that, you can always use that. I would also just say, use someone who you've gotten a B or higher in their class just in general. The B minus C plus grade, that's a failing grade in grad school. So if someone's giving you C's, it doesn't matter how friendly or nice they are, they're not giving you a passing grade for graduate school. Make sure you ask someone who's giving you those passing grades for grad school. Here, would you recommend students reach out to prospective faculty advisors you don't have to do, that's a very good question. At the PhD level, you have to, okay? And so I'll get to that in my advice there on a little bit more PhD. You need to contact a potential advisor. For the MA programs, you don't. It's not as geared towards research. It is not as specific. And so I'll be honest, if you have an excellent academic record, you have, a really good statement purpose, you got a great writing sample, we're probably going to, you got 2 letters of rec, say you're ready to go. Our program will probably take you. Okay, I'll be honest. If things look, they're looking good, we're not going to do that. Whereas the PhD level, you can have all that stuff in line and be amazing and not necessarily get accepted because of the specificity of stuff. And so that's why it's much more important at the PhD level to line yourself up with an advisor. And since you're asking about this, I'll give you my experience at Rutgers. My advisor, the year before I applied, had a student accepted that he was going to work with. And that student, at the last minute, pulled out. So the year I applied, he was owed a student and I was accepted. If that student a year before had accepted, I would have been rejected with the same materials, everything, because my advisor would have been owed a student for that year. He already had a student. And so there's also interdepartmental politics that depends on the focus of the program. So at the PhD level, it gets really specific and it's a much trickier process. MA level, if you can do the work, generally speaking, people are going to let you come in the program. Okay, that's be my take there. Other questions? These are all fantastic questions so far. Thank you, guys. So classes and workload. And so I'm just going to give you an idea here. And again, we encourage you to take graduate program. We want you to go into the grad program. We want you to do graduate work, either here at CSUB would be fantastic, or you want to go somewhere else, that's great. We also want to give you a realistic expectation of what's there. It's sometimes the biggest shock, and no matter how you explain it, students are always surprised at first semester about what the workload is, and there's some adjustments you have to make. And so generally speaking, in the humanities, it's a seminar style, okay? And I know this is definitely the case for the literature courses that they often do seminar style as well. So you're going to come in, you're going to read, as you see the workload, I would say average is like 5 articles or 1 book per week per class. Sometimes someone like a book and an article. Some people might do, I tend to sometimes do 4 articles or a book. There's a different workload there, but it's a lot. It's a lot of reading. And then you're going to come in and talk about it. And your professor doesn't really lecture. It's not like when you go to the master's program, you're going to get like a different type of lecture. No, your professor actually sits back and the students drive the conversation. Okay. And then the professor, more than anything, like in my classes, I often just sit there and just take notes. And then after a while, I chime in, either picking up on different currents I thought were interesting, tying together different thoughts. Also in the graduate program, we're focusing a lot on what we call historiography, which is like how history is written. And that's one, it's tricky in your first semester. And then after a while, you do it in enough classes, you realize like you're focusing on like debates in the field, how historians use the evidence. And on one level, this could be intimidating because we talk about it in undergrad, but we don't emphasize it. There's a lot more there's a lot on like just getting fundamental historical knowledge and then some debates. But in graduate school, it's all about debates. It's all, you go much more into a deep dive into that. But the good side of that is if you take a course, for example, like our courses could be on US history, they could be on ancient Greece and Rome, it could be on Latin America, is that once you develop that ability to understand historiography, it's easier to read about parts of the world that are unfamiliar, because then you have the skill set and you can still look at how evidence is being used. You can look at the citations, you can look at what kind of archives are being used, even if you're not an expert in Chinese history or in early colonial US, right? You can still use that there. And then also, and then just with writing, most classes, and I say this as someone who's been in this MA program, I did a master's at Temple University, and then I did a PhD at Rutgers. So I've seen a few different graduate programs. It's usually like 20 to 30 pages of writing. Some people might do a little bit more. That could be one assignment or broken up into like 3 or 4 assignments. Okay. It just depends on the professor and their choice. But just to give you an idea of the amount of writing you will do in a class, much as you know, if you're a history undergrad, there's a lot of writing, humanities in general. That said, I would check with this workload. I think it's a little different sometimes with literature. Like sometimes you might read like 2 novellas, or you might read like a short book, sometimes you large one. And so it just depends, and that workload's a little bit different. So you might want to check with those programs, but it's a similar-ish reading load. Lots of reading, lots of writing. Question here. What reading strategy would you suggest students employ to get through graduate reading? Excellent question. And so this is one that's slightly different for history than for humanity, for like literature, okay? History, it's skimming, okay? And becoming an effective skimmer. And especially with books, the most important chapters to read of a history book are the introduction and conclusion. And then in each section of each chapter, it's the first chapter, it's the first section, the introduction and conclusion of each section. If you're going to read paragraphs, first sentence, last sentence of each paragraph are the most important ones, because in history, we're really looking at argument. What I would recommend if you're reading a book is you read the introduction all the way, read conclusion all the way, and then read like 2 or 3 chapters, actually like 3 chapters all the way, and then you skim the rest of the chapters, because at that point you get an idea of what the argument's like, but you've already read through and you've gotten some of that in-depth knowledge. For history, at least, because we're so based on, I mean, there's like a narrative, but there's a lot of arguments, is that you don't have to worry about, like in literature, if you skim through a section, you might miss the butler, and at the end of it, you're like, the butler did it, but where was he? Oh, he's on like page 17 there, I missed it. And so in literature, when I'm saying, like when you're reading academic literature, like stuff written by either lit scholars or historians, skimming works really well. If you're actually reading pieces of literature, I know they have to read it all the way through. So I just want to emphasize that if you are thinking about, don't skim through a novel. That's not the way they will, they want to prove that. History, it's learning how to effectively skim. And there's different strategies. Another one is to, when you're skimming through quickly, is to look at just nouns and verbs, and don't get too caught up in the other, like the prepositional phrases and things like that. Nouns and verbs, nouns and verbs. Okay, what's going on? But that way you're kind of focusing on who's doing what. Okay. And it's a way to go through. You also will find yourself as you're skimming, if it's making sense, you continue to skim. If it stops making sense, then you need to go back and start to read a little bit more in depth. Okay, all right, I lost it. Okay, okay, I can see that there. I missed that. Okay. And then you can go back again. And so there are some strategies. Again, it's about effectively skimming though. And because you can't memorize everything that's in a book when you show up, it's important to come up with good like that you have good information and you focus on the most important information. And people bring their books to class. You can always go back and be like, hey, on page 17, wait, what page was that? You can go through and you're like, oh yeah, this person here. You can always review the book when you're in seminar and to go back for specific information. The other strategy I would give, and someone gave me this one, I think it's a very good one. After you read a book chapter or an article, is to write down like 5 things you learned. And just quickly, boom, boom, boom. And so if you're reading 5 articles, right, you've got to, and again, in articles, depending, some you can get through like in an hour. Sometimes they take like 3 or 4 hours, depending on how they're written, right? But at the end of it, if you write down 5 things you learned, okay, what are the 5 things I have? Boom, boom, boom. When you go back later, or when you're in class, like if you have 5 articles, you wrote down 5 things, you got 25 things to talk about in class. And when you go back later and review the article, even if what you wrote down wasn't the most important stuff, or maybe you didn't quite get it right, you at least know where your brain was when you last read it, as opposed to just going back to the article and like with again, where you have to kind of reread it. If it's been like a month or 2, if you're maybe working on a paper, you already have some ideas on where your brain was with it. And so that would be a good one. I think having some points to class is a good thing, coming prepared. And yeah, just some book chapters, if there's 7 chapters in a book, you wrote down 4 or 5 things at the end of every chapter, you got 30 things to discuss, right? And it could even be a question like, I'm not quite sure if this makes sense, right? That kind of stuff is fine too as well. So when you contact a graduate coordinator, I would always contact a grad coordinator, MA or PhD, and they can kind of give you some information on how many applications they're getting. Our program right now is pretty open and accepting. If you hit the requirements, if everything looks good to us, we're not going to, we want you in the program. But if, for example, if we started getting say we start getting 100 applicants, well, then we're going to have to be pickier, right? And so even if you have your minimums, you don't know how many applicants a program's getting. So you can just ask them straight up, what are you guys looking for? What's this? I would say this, if you're going to, and if they decide to meet with you, if you ask for a meeting, and this is much easier now with Zoom. I think I do this a lot with prospective students. I just, hey, do you just want to talk over Zoom? And it's much easier sometimes than trying to go back and forth on email, especially everyone's got their own specific cases and stuff like that. And one of the things I would have, and I found helpful, and I never thought of this myself, but students have had this, is they have their transcripts ready. Sometimes when they're like, especially if they're a non-major, they're like, do you think these classes would work? Right? Okay, well, let's see. And then they can screen share their transcripts with me. The other thing I would one thing to keep in mind, though, is not all schools have the same numbering system. So, for example, the UCs have a very different numbering system. Like our undergrads, like, was it 1,000 and 2,000 are lower division, 3,000, 4,000 upper division. It's very easy. UCs, I think it's like, if it's 2 numbers, it's a lower division. If it's 3 numbers, like a 100 and 200, it's upper division. And so if you're talking to someone from another school, you may want to just highlight, by the way, you just want to make sure you have an idea of what your numbers are so they know what they're looking at. Okay, because sometimes it's hard to tell. And again, I've seen like the UC transcripts, I have to go and look, I've had to like look up the numbering system because it was like not intuitive to me. Also, especially over email, the more like yes, no questions you can ask, as far as like questions that are like that you've been specific. Okay, is the deadline, I just want to make sure, what's the deadline? Do you have to like this, this writing, like the more you can be like specific to them, it's like an easier question to answer, especially over email. It's easier for them to get back to you. Okay. And also if you ask a more developed question, it also shows that you've thought about the program a little bit more. Right. And so that's good, but it also just a chance to, like, if you want them to give you a quick response to stuff, you can ask simpler questions, and the more yes, no you can make it for them, they can be like, yes, maybe, yes, no, and go through for you. Getting to the writing samples now. Different fields have different requirements. And I think in literature, like I would make sure you have, if you're doing literature, you want to make sure you have a literary analysis paper. If you're doing Spanish, for example, you want to make sure you're doing Spanish literature, not in translation, but in Spanish. You can double check with them, but I'm sure they would prefer that. In English, obviously, English is fine. For us as historians, we want one at our MA program, we want primary sources. So if you've done something this will be a very specific CSUB, if something from your historical writing class that you got a good grade on will work. Senior seminar would work. If you're not sure which one of those two, if you got like an A on one of those papers and a B+ on another one, pick the A paper. Okay, that's fine. For PhD, it's a little different. Obviously, when I say a good writing sample, but you also want to make sure that it has some relevancy to what you're pitching. And so, for example, my writing sample to my PhD program was for my MA thesis, but it had a lot of Spanish language sources because I wanted to make sure they knew I could use Spanish. Like that can't be docked against me. Like, no, I'm using sources I'm writing about Mexico and I'm using sources from Mexico, and I can do that. And so that would be at the PhD level. It's a slightly different thing there. Oh, and I would just say in general with writing samples, though, especially for history, just the primary sources, you want to show off some of your research. And so just make sure and again, and I would even say this, I mentioned that higher grade, like from historical writing, senior seminar, you pick the one with the higher grade. But if you have like a B+ paper from your historical writing class, you can always kind of touch it up as well. All right. So the writing sample, you don't have to show, this is like my final product I sent in class. If you had some things some typos you need to work out, fix the typos and then submit it to us. Because we're not looking at, like, we're not going to grade you on what was your final product. We just want to see your potential. Okay. So that's something you can do as well. Touch it up. But the most important thing is show off your primary source, your ability to use primary sources. And if you're not a history major, that's especially important. Different fields and different requirements, PhD considerations. So I will tie in, there's this question here about being knowledgeable in another language. That's a good question. So for an MA, no. MA, your language is fine. If you do want to do a thesis in a region, like for example, in Latin America, because I'm a Latin Americanist, you would need to have some knowledge of Spanish or Portuguese. Also, what is knowledge is different. You need to be able to read sources from that region so that's a slightly different thing as opposed to being like a fluent speaker of the language. You need to be able to utilize that language so you can utilize the sources. In a lot of programs, in a PhD level, you will have to pass an exam. Some programs require you pass an exam, or like in my program, there was no exam, but there would be stuff in Spanish and Portuguese assigned. And so you had to be able to read it. And so it was like sink or swim, right? And so in other programs, you have to actually take exams on your language, but it actually usually involves, they give you a text in the language and you have to be able to translate it into English. And back when I was in graduate school, I'm dating myself here, guys. There used to be pocket translators. Now everything's like Google Translate or whatever, but you could use a pocket translator or like I give you a book translator. Like you could get help. And the most important thing is it's not that you could like off the top of your head translate everything perfectly, although some people can. It was that you can, with resources, you can translate this stuff. Academic, like the knowledge, using a language for academic purposes is a little bit different than for like everyday speaking. That said, if you are pitching yourself to be a French historian or a German historian, having some knowledge of the language is important. Okay, again, but not the MA level, PhD level. That languages are important. Some schools will require, they'll sometimes require you to have like 2 or 3 languages. So just look at those programs and see what their language requirements are. Sometimes actually academic articles are easier to read in languages because there's certain common academic structures and phrases and stuff like that than like everyday language, which can be much more dynamic and floral and, you know, kind of have a lot of little differences there. Also, so let's see, you have their history. Oh, yes. And so with the advisor thing, just coming back to it for a PhD program, that one's a very specific one. And like I said, you could be highly qualified and still not get accepted depending on the interdepartmental politics. And the PhD is a different beast than the MA. So if you have a BA, you can apply for an MA in history. You can also just apply straight ahead for a PhD in history. You don't always have to do the MA to get the PhD. A lot of people end up getting an MA and then they do their PhD. Both are fine. It kind of depends on where you are and how ready you are to do a project and ready to do the dissertation. It's hard for sometimes to apply for the PhD. You don't know what the interdepartmental politics are. So I would definitely apply to multiple schools, regardless of how high your GPA is. You could be 4.0. If they're still requiring your GRE scores could be the top 4.0. Everything looks great and you can still get rejected. And so that's a little bit different. MA program, that's not an issue. If you're hitting the stuff, if you're hitting everything that you need, there's a really good chance you'll get accepted. That said, we want you to succeed. We want you to finish. And so we will accept you in the program. You know, we want you in the program. We want as many people as we can get in the program, but we also want to make sure we have people that are going to succeed. You coming in for 2 or 3 years and then never finishing and then having that potentially piling up debt for a degree that you never get. It doesn't serve you well. It doesn't serve us well. And so we do want you to succeed and we want you to finish. And once you are here, if you're concerned, there's some adjustments of graduate school. We have your students, your classmates are great resources, but all your professors have gone through graduate school. So we can always give you help and advice.
So just to touch back on the GPA and the personal statement, I'm in the middle of working on my personal statement right now. And so I have like a cumulative 3.0. But in the past, like 2 years or at CSUB, it's a 3.8. I do mention in my personal statement that there is an educational gap. So basically, I tried to do college first time, didn't do well, and then came back and I've been doing excellent since. So I have that in my personal statement, but when it's being looked at, are people going to be looking at the 3.0 or the 3.8?
So that's a good question. And there's some flexibility here, but technically it's supposed to be, it's actually over your last 60 credits. And the idea is that you're a B student or above at the upper division level. You have a definite narrative of progress. That's really good. And you have this like high achievement at the end. So that's a really good narrative. I don't see like any issues arising from that, right? And you just explain, hey, again, and there's several reasons why things don't fall into place, and all of a sudden they fall into place and achievement happens. Improvement of GPA is always a good thing. If, for example, your last 60 credits, there's like some issues where it's like, oh, it's not quite 30 or what, it's not quite a 3.0 or what, like it's like borderline, but there's this high achievement towards the end of it. And if it looks like things have clicked, that's really good. And I have a friend, I'll just give you just an example. I have a friend of mine who has his PhD, who started out college. He had like a 2. He was like kind of almost on academic probation when he started out his career. And then he found history courses and he realized he loved history. And all of a sudden, and his GPA, I think, was in the low 3s, but he was able to get into doctorate programs because it's like clearly a thing of like him kind of struggling at the beginning. He got into his major, clearly success. And we're definitely looking for success in the major. In the graduate program, there's no GE. We don't care about your math score. So if you got like a D in a math class, we do not care. All right. If you're, as long as you get like to hit the qualifying GPA for us, and there's a great narrative, we're pretty happy with that. If your grades were in, bad grades were in science, that to us that's not an issue. And the MA program is very much specific about there. So I would just say that to me doesn't, like, at least from hearing what you're saying, I'm not worried about. But that doesn't sound anything like a worrying proposition. And especially if there was something that happens where the GPA is like, it's like a little bit borderline, again, that's the overall number, and we can focus on the last 60 credits. And so that also is, like that allows us, and most students are usually better in their last 60 credits than they were in their first 60. And did you say you had another question?
My other question is, so when I'm talking about my undergrad research experience, so I'm a psychology major. I hope to be presenting my research at the WPA in April. So in my personal statement, do I say like, I hope to be presenting, like pending an approval from the IRB, or like, how would I go about? Because I mean, I haven't actually accomplished it yet, but I'm in the works, but I need to be accepted before I go to the WPA. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, UIC is like, maybe upon IRB approval, I plan on presenting at this conference. Once I receive IRB approval, I plan on it presenting at this conference. Yeah, and I think that's because you're being honest. Like these are your legitimate plans, and you're waiting on something. And then also, it still looks good because the fact that you're looking to present at a conference is the fact that you're even looking into it is a good. That's good. I would just state the truth. But also, I wouldn't say what I would avoid is like, I hope to avoid. You're just like, upon, like, once I get IRB approval, I plan to, like, I will apply, or whatever. I will present this conference, just to be a little bit more like assertive with your language. You can't go wrong telling the truth. So that's fine.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, one more question for you. Where does the cover letter come into place? Is that not really a thing for applications anymore?
That's a good question. So for us, our cover letter basically is the statement of purpose. And so that would be, I mean, you can frame it if you want to, the statement of purpose. You could frame it like, dear selection committee, or whatever, if you want to put it on there. Some people do make it in a letter, some people do not. We're pretty flexible on it. So you might want to check by program, but generally speaking, if there was a cover letter, if they're saying separate cover letter from statement of purpose, if that's a thing where they're saying like, we want a cover letter and a statement of purpose, that would be, the cover letter would be kind of very pro forma, just introducing the just like the contents of your application. If they're not saying, if they say a cover letter and it doesn't say a personal statement, I would throw the personal statement in the cover letter.
Cool. Thank you very much.
No problem. Yeah, and like I said, as long as your like personal statement, again, if it's like long pages and pages, I wouldn't make it pages and pages, but anytime that you can give us a little bit more feedback, again, some transcripts tell an easy story, right? And even some of them, the ones where you see improvement, right? Or just like this huge, oh wow, again, like there might be a gap, right? And then also you see a way higher GPA. That story is pretty logical, but I would use a personal statement to sometimes fill in the gaps on stuff, just to provide some background information to help people when they're looking at your materials. You're also kind of guiding them through your career. And again, it's not always about hitting. And actually, sometimes people who have never had struggles and have constantly succeeded, sometimes when they hit graduate school, they hit struggles for the first time, and they may not always have those skills to bounce back. And so one of the things you can always, now we still always, achievement's great, having that ability to bounce back or to reflect and to change gears, that's a good thing to show, because it's something you would probably have to do at some point in your graduate career. Thank you very much, guys. I've really enjoyed the questions here. They're really stimulating. And thank you, Emma, for, making this a very smooth production. And so, one more thing. Let me go to the end here, as I realize I have one more slide. And it's nothing major here, but obviously with further questions, but you have my information here. I'm the associate professor and director of the history graduate program. Also, if you have more questions about the school, the arts and humanities, you can contact the Spanish and the English, or the modern languages, which runs the Spanish MA program, in the English department, about their stuff as well. If you have any other questions, though, I'm always around. There's my email. I will gladly respond to you by email, gladly meet with you in person or Zoom as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for your presentation.
You make me feel